peeled apart connecting rods and everything. They're not stamped at all, so I just went ahead and lightly bolted this back together, and we're just going to stamp this. These are just aluminum connecting rods on the newer SAYLOR BEAL air compressors, so you want to make sure you keep these oriented the right direction. They'll only fit on the crank one way, so don't get them backwards or mix up your connecting rod caps. The instructions are explicit about that, so just like an engine. Okay, trying to be very careful. I don't like clamping this in the vise like this very much, but I do have a rag in there to try and stop it from damaging it. So. Okay, a lot more satisfied with that one than I am with the top one. I'm just doing one for the low pressure. I'll do the same thing on the high pressure. And then I think I'm going to stamp the pistons as well, just so that we know which way is front. I mean, I've got this recorded, but I think it's just good practice. If I ever have to take this apart again, I'll just mark it in line with this wrist pin, and then we know. So here is what the crank looks like in here, at least on the low pressure side. Actually looks really good. There's nothing in there to be worried about. There's nothing to catch your finger on at all. Any of that stuff that you're seeing on there that looks like unevenness is just a little bit of oil. So I don't expect we're going to find too much on that. You can see there's a little bit of galling in here, and that bearing is ready to be replaced. Luckily we caught this in time so it didn't damage the crank. I would imagine the other side's going to be the same. And then something else to note is, look at how shiny that is. I think that's had a lot of thrust. Not so much on this side. That could have been due to that piston being screwed up, so we'll see how the other connecting rod looks when we pull it off. And another thing to note is these bolts in here, these socket head cap screws, were so tight I actually had to use the impact gun to get them undone. And I think the book says 75 foot-pounds. I'll have to look again. But they were probably easily 2-3 times that tight. I mean, they were insanely tight. So I don't know, maybe they were trying to compensate for something like wear. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this piston now, and I'll do that off camera. I'm going to take this end plate off, and normally I don't like sticking anything like this in between two machine surfaces, but I can guarantee you're not going to get this off unless you do. Alright. So that's kind of what we didn't want, but it's alright. So that end cap comes off, and then we're going to just gently pull this free of the unloader and slip the crank out. Try not to touch those journals, but I can't help it. And then there's your unloader. So I don't know, that looks like it's kind of like an old flyweight on a steam engine. So that's how that works. So I'm just going to set this aside. I'm going to try and, let me just get a clean rag here. I don't want to scrape anything around in that surface here on the race. So here's the race. And I will be pulling that unloader off as well. We've got gaskets for that. So you can see some wear where this wears in. And where the rollers have been riding on there, but it's not terrible. It's not overly excessive. But I thought I'd give you a view into the belly of the beast here and show you the unloader so that you're clear on what exactly that looks like inside of here. So let me slip the camera in here. Hopefully you can see right there in the end. That's where that little pin goes. Okay, so that's why you've got to pull it off this end first. I mean, you could pull it off the unloader end, but I think it's easier to pull it off here. I'll probably pop it in this side first or something, then put the unloader back on. But I'm just disassembling right now, so got the crankcase all cleaned up and pretty much all the gasket seals. I've got them scotch brighted down and cleaned up, and then we'll do a final rinse with solvent, make sure it's all good and clean inside. And I think we've, of course, got the unloader to do, and then the outside of the case to clean and paint. And then we're going to tear down this other piston. You don't need to see that, it's the same. And then the last thing we need to do is change out, of course, your babbitt bearings or your shell bearings, and then these needle roller bearings up in the top of the connecting rods. And then we can start with reassembly. Okay, time to take off the unloader compartment. Let's see if we can get this thing off without having everything go everywhere. I've already got the bolts undone. They're just for these socket head cap screws. So, apologize if the camera's bouncing around a little bit, but you're sitting on the table. Now, I'm not sure how this pops off here. Whether both the front and back come off together. We're going to find out together. Now, there you go. Just whacking on that with a rubber mallet so we don't damage anything. And your 4 socket head cap screws go into this, I guess you'd call it a boss. But there's not much to the unloader. One thing I am noticing, if you look inside there, I don't know if you can see down in here, look in the end of there, that looks a little out of round. So that may be something we need to take out and look a little closer at. But for right now, I'm just going to put my screws in here and keep those from getting lost. I'm kind of out of room in my trays, so what we're going to do is unbolt this, and we'll take off this back boss as well and see if it's got a gasket behind it and get her all cleaned up. I already loosened that one a little bit. These aren't even as tight as the connecting rod bolts were. However, tightening up those connecting rod bolts didn't want them to come off. I think that's probably why you're seeing the wear that we did where the rod halves meet, where that bearing, like right here on this end, was. It's probably because they over tightened it. Now, when you tighten down a bearing on an engine, you do want some crush, so it will splay out this way. That provides a little area for the oil, and then it allows it to have a sort of an oil reserve, and then that gets sucked underneath your bearing. But your bearing is not actually a bearing. In fact, your crank or cam or whatever it happens to be should never touch that. Your bearing is the oil. So, unloader is off. We're just going to set this over here on the table out of the way, and that gasket's actually in pretty good shape. Wouldn't mind saving that for a pattern. I've got a machine that it's kind of like a Cricut, but I can scan any gasket to accurate dimensions, put them in Photoshop or whatever, and then I can actually cut my own gaskets out of gasket paper. So it's kind of nice. Okay, that's interesting. Bright yellow gasket in here. But that just pops off, and wow, that is super shiny in there. You need to see this. Unlike most of the other gasket surfaces, now I wonder if that means they've been into this unloader before. 'Cause I know they've been into other parts of this. The question is why. It's like buying an old car. Somebody parked it for a reason. So, I'm going to get this stuff cleaned up, take a look at the end of that unloader, and see if we need to do something with that. I guess it's kind of a bushing on the end of there. Alright, so I hope you can see down inside there. It looks like you can. What I'm seeing down inside of there, if you'll look close, is actually a Schrader valve. And it may or may not show up on camera, but if you look where this is blurred kind of sideways right here, right there, where that's kind of blown out, that Schrader valve is also pointing that direction. And that could be contributing to our oil loss. So we're definitely going to have to do something to address that. And I don't know that there's much you can do with this aside from pulling that valve out. I may be able to put this on the lathe and bore it out and then put in a sleeve, something like that. It's probably going to be the easiest option. I don't know if Sailor Beal even sells these, or Pacific, but I think we're going to have to call them and give them a part number. So I was able to get these gaskets off in one piece, surprisingly. So to me, I think that's just telling me that somebody's replaced these before. And with it being so shiny like that, I mean, it is like it's polished. I'm sitting here looking at it. It almost looks like it's tinned. Very strange. Alright, so in messing around with this, you know what this is? That's not the case. It looked like it was the case. This is a shim. So, kind of an important part to keep track of. I don't know how thick this shim is. Let's grab some calipers and find out. I'm guessing, let's see here, 5/1000ths? Let's see if I'm right. Let's wipe off some of the schmutz. Got my trusty vernier calipers here that are reading -0. Now I'm measuring on the flats of those. Huh! How's that for an eyeball? So, we need to be darn careful we don't lose that. But I do not know if there's another shim in that gasket pack, or if we're just going to have to reuse that one. And it looks to me like somebody's blued this with Prussian blue, which I find very interesting. Maybe they're trying to get a contact pattern under torque. I have no idea. It doesn't say anything about that in the manual. It says nothing about shimming that or end play, so, you know, not real impressed with the manual, but maybe we just put that one back in. We'll see if there's any additional instructions in the gasket pack. Alright, so this is the entire gasket pack. I just dumped this in the box here for the sake of showing you. So we've got 3 of these type of seals here. This is like the one we pulled out. And then this one, it feels like a shim. Looks like about a 10,000 shim. I think this is a 5,000 shim. So we're definitely going to save those shims from the old setup and figure out how we're supposed to set our thrust on here, because that really doesn't say anything. And I'd like to know definitively before I start screwing around with stuff. And honestly, I don't want to have to keep putting this together and taking it apart. Maybe we can check our thrust with a dial indicator. But there again, how much end play is acceptable. So clearly something was going on with that unloader. I'm a little concerned about that, being that, you know, this pin here has, I mean, look at that, it's kind of like moving around. I don't know if you can see that, but, you know, she's spring loaded, and if it's coming out sideways, that could have been what damaged that Schrader valve. What I'm seeing here I'm not liking too much. See how that's only popping one side? We might need to look into that a little further. It doesn't hold the other side out either. Oh boy, let the fun begin. After hours action out here in the shop. I had to build this valve stem removal tool because my actual valve stem removal tool is way too short to get inside there. So I'm going to replace this Schrader valve, and I'm probably going to sleeve this just on the outside so we can keep that unloader concentric and fix this. That shouldn't be too hard as long as we don't get down to the threads. So I'll just put a little bit of bronze in there or something and we should be fixed up. But you can see that valve in there doesn't look great. I had a hard time getting a hold of it because it was so bent. So I've got some Schrader valves sitting on the shelf, and we'll get that put in and fixed. Okay, so I'm going to have to blow this out. But you can see the idea. I'm just trying to true this hole up so that we can put a sleeve in there and keep that unloader pin more concentric. Okay, so I've gone ahead and just cleaned this up on the wire wheel. And if you look down inside there, I also sprayed that out with cleaner. And that looks pretty good. Now I've got to figure out what we're going to do about the sleeve to go in there. The basic plan here is to make a sleeve that goes in here. I'll be boring that sleeve out on the lathe and then pressing it in here. Probably want about a 1 to 2/1000 press fit, and then I'll throw in some red Loctite just to keep it in place. Probably doesn't even need it, but that'll help to reinforce these threads, and it'll help to have that guide pin on the end of this crank. Let's see if I can show you. So this will go over the end of this. Some of you might be wondering why I would even go to the trouble to make this sleeve on here. I'm going to tell you why. I was on the phone with Pacific Air Compressors earlier today, and the part that I'm holding right here, just this, is $27 without shipping. Now, I went ahead and had them price the piston and the unloader as well. Piston is $180, which is almost as much as the entire rebuild kit. Additionally, this really did not make me happy. We'll just say that. Additionally, these bearings in here, these needle roller bearings, $25 a piece, and they don't even have them. You have to drop ship them. So combine all that together, 180 bucks on the piston, another 50 bucks for the bearings and the rods, and then another 27 bucks for this. I'm into this compressor about $1,000 already because I purchased that for $350. Now granted, I got this monster of a 5 horsepower motor here, but I don't want to be spending $1,000 on this. I mean, for 1,700 bucks, I've priced them. I can get a whole compressor unit that's brand new. So why would I want to spend $1,700 on that, right? And the thing is, I have a whole machine shop at my disposal. Let me just show you a couple of the tools I have so you understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. Excuse my mill is a little noisy here. I've got that phase converter running. But got a Super 55 index mill, 30-ton shop press, 2 band saws, a shaper, a lathe, and behind me here I've got the entire Black & Decker valve shop. Doesn't make any sense to me to invest in parts if I can make them myself and they're just as good. I've got all the machines, might as well use them. Back to work. Okay, so I wanted to do a close-up view of this with the cell phone camera so that you could see in here better. I've got the flash on to give us some extra light, but you can see right there is the sleeve I put in. And then if you look down inside there, you can see we've got a new valve. So that Schrader valve's brand new, and she's sealed up. So saved us $30, good as new. Wants to see the progress on the SAYLOR BEAL. So this is the crankcase. I just peeled the tape off, and we're clean inside there. I'll give it another wipe down before we put anything back together. I've got to paint the bolts, but the cylinder's ready to go back on. Let's see if I can turn you around here. It's all ready to go. So the next step, we'll be putting that cylinder together, and then I'm going to paint the parts that are sitting here. So this is the centrifugal unloader housing, basically. I've got to mask all that and paint it, but I've brushed that and cleaned it up, and then I've got the crankcase cover here, and then I've got to rebuild the head, clean it up, the intercooler, and the flywheel. And, of course, this nightmare. So, we will be doing that next. And I'm super excited to paint those guards because they're full of grease and dirt, and of course that expanded metal is going to be hard to sand. So, we'll see how that goes. But we're making good progress. Oh, and I still had to paint the rest of the motor. I got the back cover painted. So this is why my videos are taking so long. I would have already had this put back together if I was just putting it back together with new parts. And of course the repairs on the unloader valve. So stay tuned for more. Okay fellas, in between getting high on paint here, I decided I'm going to put this compressor back together a different way. Maybe a little smarter way, and that is one piece at a time, and I'll just build it right here on the compressor base itself, which I did touch up the paint on. That's another reason, trying not to scratch the piss out of it. But I think it looks good. Got the intercooler going, and I'll show you this too. Of course, all the crank parts to reassemble. I did find this number on here. I don't know if you can see that. So this is a Torrington bearing, and it's a B1212 for the wrist pin. And I found a new set for $17 with free shipping. So that sounds a little better than 25 bucks a piece plus shipping, I think. So I may just pop on that. Although, looking at these, I really don't think there's a lot wrong with them. They just felt a little loose on that wrist pin. But I hate to put that together and then have to take it all apart. Because if you look at these gaskets, I think these are a special gasket here. This is the head gasket. I think it's one of those dry lawn gaskets. So then I'd have to pop on a new gasket, offsetting the cost. So logically, I think it makes more sense to just go ahead and get it. Just a quick note, something I discovered when I was putting back this sight window to see about your oil fill level, is I noticed that the gasket kit did not give me a paper gasket to go back behind there for some reason. So what I did was to Teflon tape the threads, and then I've installed a rubber O-ring around that, as you can see. I think that'll seal better anyway, but we're going to try it out and see how that works. I planned to replace that, or make a paper gasket or something. I just didn't want to make a paper gasket, and I figured that rubber O-ring and the Teflon tape will do a lot better jobs.